It's Wellness Wednesdays. It's Wellness Wednesdays, and today we are talking reactants. And I'm surprised I haven't done something on reactants before. I think it's because people tend to be reactant regarding the concept of reactants, and people don't like admitting when they've been emotionally compromised because people see it as weak instead of human. And if I could do something to aid the dialogue and the discourse, I'd like to pull the paradigm away from that. Fearing change is something we all struggle with. It's a human thing. People like to be consistent. Now, different people have different degrees of reactance, but it is pointless to try to deny that an individual is immune from reactance. We need to accept the fact we're all somewhat prone to it. So, we can keep our own personal level of reactance at a moderate to low level, right? And if you like this sort of content, help support this channel. Become a monthly patron on patreon.com/Leanna K. Patrons are going to get some very exciting news coming up very soon. Or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/Leanna K. Keep the love going with that. Okay, so reactance is not the same as resistance. Reactance is about a strong emotional response to a belief that a freedom is being threatened or eliminated or restricted. And obviously your constructs, your opinions surrounding freedom and what it is and what it means are going to inform your level of reactance. But then I do think there is also a trauma component. I mean, hypervigilance is a symptom of PTSD. I know it well. And part of that for me is the interplay of avoidance and hypervigilance. When you are struggling with a trauma, especially a long-term trauma, especially complex traumas, you are very aware of the drain, the limitations. And so any additional thing that is just another thing you have to deal with, people can respond in a way that doesn't make sense to other people. And it can become very difficult when you're in a reactant state. One, to understand what's happening to you if you don't understand the concept of reactance in the first place, but also to communicate what's going on. And one of the things I find very frustrating about activism is that most activists are actually terrible with actually supporting people who have trauma or who are in a high state of reactance. Now, I cut my teeth on this stuff, on homophobia and gay bashing in the 1990s, and I saw some stuff. There was straight up bigotry that was just, okay, call it like I see it. But then there were other people that were the actual literal definition of homophobic. I remember a couple guys, I watched them suddenly break out into a sweat when they found out there was a gay man or a gay boy in the room. And when somebody's breaking out into a sweat, that is not a conscious response. That is a visceral reaction, and we don't know what happened to that person. And that's why I'm so ambivalent on the whole phobic thing, right? Fear of certain things, fear of things that are different, fear of things that are poorly understood is not the same as hating those things, right? Because hate there is a level of narrative. There is a level of conscious thought. Yes, I guess there's a level of narrative and fear, but it is understandable that people fear what they don't understand. And I do think that a lot of these culture war issues are bad actors using people's natural reactant tendencies to impede change, right? This and what I find interesting is the way reactance is being leveraged. The feeling that somebody's taken away our freedom, somebody's taken away, taking, right? Taking that narrative. They're taking our jobs, they're taking our freedoms, they're taking our sense of normalcy, they're taking our women, they're taking our men, right? That reactance narrative is seen everywhere from, the so-called alt-right, the alternative to what? I don't know. To, TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists. They're taking something from us. They're taking something from us. And you want to motivate someone, make them feel like something's under threat. And for years, that's what the conservative movement used to motivate working class voters to vote against their own interests, because of convincing them that single issue voting surrounding certain moral paradigms and the Supreme Court, that was like the number one voting issue for people. It didn't matter anything else that was on all the pocketbook issues on a given ballot didn't matter. It was just they're taking our God, they're taking our religious freedom, they're taking our parental rights, they're taking, right? Now, of course, that there's a 6-3 Supreme Court in the U.S., all of a sudden the left has discovered reactance. But the left spoke in the language of reactance in different ways. I feel unsafe. You're taking away my freedom of movement. You're taking away my I don't feel safe. And of course, if you actually examine it, there's no safety issue in a lot of those cases. But you can't tell a reactant person they're being reactant. Why? Because they're in a state of reaction. They're in a state of reactance. It is so strong. It is so overwhelming, because it is a feeling. This is why I'm such a stickler for I think versus I feel, because feelings happen faster than cognitive thoughts. So if you've got a feeling a strong feeling in the way of a person's ability to cognitively understand your rational argument, that rational argument is not going to land. If you actually want to persuade someone, you have to calm them down to the point that they will actually listen to you. And I had an experience on Sunday where there was a very reactant chat on a stream I did. It wasn't my stream, because you guys know I don't allow nasty gram comments based on reactance. And I think there are a lot of reactant behaviors online that are dismissed as trolling. And to me, they're not the same thing, because a troll, I have been known to troll. A true troll is not emotionally invested in something. A lot of these people who use culture war buzzwords, I think, actually are emotionally invested. They're coming from essentially a good place where they care very deeply about, say, the abuse of children, but they don't. Then they get into this weird mental emotional loop where, admitting you have feelings, admitting something bothers you is bad, like what we talked about on Monday. So you're not supposed to let people know something bothers you. So you're going to pretend that it doesn't bother you. But the reason you're fixated on this particular issue is, let's face it, even the abstract of the abuse of children is super, super triggering to a lot of people. If you are a victim of abuse yourself and have not come to terms with it, or feel like you can't talk about it, that's even worse. But it's the cycle of, I can't tell something's bothering me, which is Well, I think the whole thing's bullshit. It's much more healthy, even if you take some shit in the short term, to say, no, I don't like that. Cut it out. And see who your friend and who isn't. Because to me, if you say something bothers you and people persist, that's on them, not you. I actually find it bothers me less when I say this bothers me and people keep going, because it's like, okay, now I can reasonably dismiss them as assholes, as opposed to people who just don't know what they're doing is bothersome. But a lot of people aren't there yet. And that's what I think fuels a lot of reactant cycles. Like I said, it's this very PTSD-like thing of the cycle of hypervigilance and avoidance. You want to avoid feeling a feeling, and so that feeling becomes an increasingly strong driver of your behavior. And everybody has things that are going to put them in a reactant state. The technical term for it gets a giggle because it's motivational arousal. So it's not just a strong feeling, it is actually a motivating emotional state. And that's why it's so powerful. And the idea of freedom and control is so core to a lot of people and their personal identity, accurately or not. We have so pathologized self-esteem that even the idea that somebody might have low self-esteem is a difficult thing for people to admit, to the point that we so focused on self-esteem instead of concepts like self-compassion and self-acceptance that we created this culture of induced narcissism and created a lot of people who were extremely fragile, unable to feel their feelings because low self-esteem bad, therefore I can't possibly have low self-esteem. Oh God, what if something makes me feel bad? Get it away. Right? So people have these very strong reactions. People lash out. People behave illogically. You watch them doing it, and anyone from the outside, sees plain as day what's going on here, but the person in the reactant state can't. Why? Because they're having a profoundly motivating emotional response to things that is happening. So the word that comes to mind is exquisitely, but people are like, what does that mean? It is so strong and so profound and so hijacking of the intellect that, yes, a person has become irrational and they can't help it. And the problem is social media is a terrible medium for dealing with those states of reactance. A lot of people read a lot of things into comments I make, and I look at this like, how the heck did they get that? Well, something triggered an emotional state. All right, fine. And people on both sides of the culture war have been so convinced that their feelings, their sense of freedoms are under threat, that it's a raw nerve. And then you get something like what's going on in various parts of the US, or the weird way Canadian news gets filtered down into the US. And that's a tough one for me, because I see the way it's reported and I see the media that Americans are consuming, and I realize that, oh gee, if something was presented to me that way, I'd think it was pretty terrible and I'd be pretty upset about it. The only problem is that's not actually what it is. But once someone has had that, you're coming for my freedoms, they can't be reasoned with. They can't be reasoned with. They can only be soothed. And in social media, when you've got dozens of people coming at you at the same time, you cannot take the time and soothe every single person. Added to that problem is that you have to soothe the feelings but not accept bad behavior. So if somebody starts, flinging a string of expletives and personal attacks at you because they're in a reactive state, That's not okay behavior. You can understand the feelings behind it, at least in the abstract, but you can't validate the behavior. And that level of nuance it unfortunately requires a level of emotional development that people who exist in fairly frequent or ongoing states of reactance, they never develop that nuance because they are constantly reacting to perceived threats. And what happens when someone is constantly in that fight or flight state, when someone it is at its core the "you're not my parent, you can't make me," childhood development reaction. And that is not minimizing it. That is an indication of a really deep-seated trauma that needs to be validated and unpacked. You can't do that when someone is flinging dirty words at you, right? No one is required to accept abuse. That is not anybody's burden to carry. Personal responsibility is a thing. Problem is, everything's so reactant now. The idea of personal responsibility has gone off the window. But and you see the Gordian knot, the Ouroboros, the which came first, the chicken or the egg problem, in reducing resistance and persuading and trying to overcome people's denial that this thing they have been taught is no good, very bad, freedom is actually not what they were led to believe. And you get into a bunch of other guilt and shame dynamics. I do think reactance, guilt, and shame are very, very tied. People tend to be in denial because they don't want to feel shame. So they create these narratives in their head that it's not about shame, it's about freedom. And they just get so far out over their skis, so far down the road that they can't stop and examine their behavior, because the guilt, that guilt and shame they're trying to outrun would be so strong at that point, they can't cope. And so this is the challenge with persuasion. This is the challenge with civil rights. I mean, civil rights work, progress, is all about overcoming reactance, overcoming resistance, right? And when you have people with a lot of money actively bombarding people with the idea that the freedom to parent their kids the way they see fit is under a threat, the freedom to identify any way they want is under threat. That's why you see the language of coercion used so often in politically bad actors, right? They're forcing kids, they're forcing me, they're forcing their lifestyle, forcing. It's trying to invoke reactance, right? And the minute they hit that, well, you got to get people out of a reactant state before you can reason with them. And so what the political extremes do is just keep hitting that button of reactance. I mean, the TERF movement's full of it. Women are losing their sex-based rights. Sex-based rights? Like, if people aren't in a reactive state, they would realize how ridiculous that is. Universal rights are not subjective. The whole idea of discrimination on the basis of sex is implied in sex-based rights. Oh, there's one set of rights for men and another set of rights for women? Really? Really? That sounds like a complementarian worldview, which is that men and women are separate with complementary social roles, which destroys individual freedoms. Because what do you mean there's rights that one group of people have versus another group of people? The whole idea of rights is that they are universal and unalienable. It's absurd. But somebody convinced these women that they were under threat by something, induced reactance, and got a response. And it's a great way to get people to stop thinking, act against their own best interests, and actually help claw away the freedoms they so cherish, the rights they so cherish, the dignity they so cherish. And that's why it's really important to understand this concept. And that's why it's really important, one, to feel your feelings. Because the more you try to deny something, the stronger it becomes in terms of emotional response instead of logical response. Two, unpack and compassionately question your reactions. Why am I feeling this way? Not to self-gaslight and say, oh, you're making it too big a deal about this. No, understand the core of the feelings. Because your feelings are valid. But maybe there's a way not to feel such overwhelming bad feelings. And then coming to terms with, if you think I believe in taking the terms the word overreacted out of your vocabulary. You may have to say it to keep the peace with some people, but internally, overreacted, you reacted. You didn't overreact, you reacted. Who's to say over, right? You had a strong response to something. Why? Be good to yourself and validate that response. And don't treat it as something you did wrong. Treat it as something you can learn from. You learn something about yourself when people hit you in the gut with something. I mean, everybody knows I have a very strong reaction to people who go after trans people. And it's a weird abstraction in my mind. It is because the number of transgender people is so small that it shouldn't be this big a deal. To me, the right to self-identification is the core of freedom. And people throw up straw man arguments about this. Well, why can't people change their race if they can change their gender? One, they're not changing their gender. It's how they feel inside. It's not changing. They're just getting their outsides to match the insides. Two, race as we see it is a series of categories that is socially constructed, as opposed to it is an identity that is forced on people by society, not an innately held identity. That's why the idea of changing your race or anything like that is not seen as the same. The other thing that was a real wake-up call for me was when people who are specialists in their field, psychologists, psychiatrists, are like, no, gender identity is a very real thing for a lot of people. And this is where theory of mind comes in, right? This was a foreign concept to me. The idea that somebody could feel male, could feel female, that is something I have never experienced. And I go, well, if other people feel things that innate, that are so different from my experience, then that means different people want different things. And the fundamental right to being an individual must be respected, especially when we do not understand it, And that's important. That's important to the whole idea of freedoms. And if you truly believe in freedom, you cannot allow your own personal reactance to cause you to trample the rights of other people. And that's why you have to defend the rights of people you disagree with, and in, a great many cases you can't stand. Because that's how you know you're actually operating on principle and not just reactance. And that's when you're actually operating on a paradigm of universal rights and freedoms as opposed to just freedoms for me but not for thee. Because it's easy to defend the rights of people like you, who you see as an extension of self, who you agree with and think are good people. It's a very different thing to defend the rights of people you think are terrible. And that doesn't mean you defend their behavior. That doesn't mean you defend their motivations. It means you defend their rights. Because rights apply to everyone. And if you believe that someone else's rights are infringing upon yours, well, then it's either no longer a right or you're not actually respecting another person's freedom. One person's rights end where yours begin. That's the idea of boundaries. One person's freedoms end when they impede on another person's freedoms. And I think we all understand this concept in the abstract, but applying it can be difficult because of the reality of emotional reactance. So if you find yourself being reactive, it is really important to slow down and not. Rule of thumb for Leanna, don't react outwardly as long as you're aware you're reacting inwardly. Stop, take stock, get your center back, and then respond. This is not a race. Okay? So I'm really interested in your comments with this. You know what's coming. Help support this channel if you like Wellness Wednesdays. Patreon.com/LeannaK, and buy a Leanna Care session for somebody who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/LeannaK. There are some spaces left with Leanna Care's one-on-one sessions on Thursdays. We're rapidly getting to the point where I'm going to have to add another day of the week. It has been booked. It is 8 hours solid on Wednesdays. We're up to like 5 hours on Thursdays. So there is some space for people who want to have one-on-ones. One-on-ones are a really great way, I'm finding, even for people to discuss issues that become very reactive in the public space. I've had some really great issues-based discussions with people that were very affirming and were very positive because it wasn't on social media, and I could soothe and keep things slow and allow people to have those waves of reactance and acceptance and reactance and acceptance. And it was a very positive experience for everyone involved. So thanks for your support. Thanks for your feedback. Thanks for your support of Wellness Wednesdays, and be well.